Hey there, welcome back to another review, this time of the 1982 science fiction masterpiece and masterclass of filmmaking that is Blade Runner. Now, Blade Runner is a film that, honestly, I didn't care for the first time I saw it. I expected something that I didn't get. I thought it was going to be more of a thriller. I thought it was going to have more action in it, and it didn't have that. And this was at a point in time where I didn't really have as much knowledge of cinema in general. Like I didn't really have as much hours logged when it comes to watching films, or I didn't really watch as many films, period. So I just had heard so many great things about Blade Runner from my friends and my family, and I like science fiction, so it's a movie that I went into with pretty high expectations, and I thought it was boring. I thought it was slow paced, and I wasn't a fan of it. There were things about it that I really liked, that I did appreciate. I love the production and art design. I love the look of the film. I liked the score of Evangelos. I even liked some of the performances, and I thought the concept was quite good, and I thought it was an interesting idea. I just thought it could have been, better, and I was kind of wondering why this is a film that was considered to be a masterpiece by so many. But even after that, I still kept giving this film a chance because I'm such a big fan of science fiction, because I'm such a big fan of films in general. And as I started to watch more and more movies, as I started to see more films, to be able to build more of a catalog in my head of what films I personally feel are good or what films I personally feel are bad, this movie really is one of those films that started to grow on me. But I still wasn't completely in love with the movie. I had issues with the film. I still thought it was too slow paced and so on and so forth. And it was one of those movies that I liked watching for the visuals, but it wasn't really a movie that I felt that engaged me that much in terms of the story and with its characters. But then I picked up this DVD set from FYE for fairly cheap when I was living in Oklahoma City. And this is the same set, by the way, that I got. And I watched it again one night, and I was absolutely blown away and floored by the film. And when I laid my eyes on the final cut, that's when I really came to fall in love with Blade Runner. And that's when I really learned to appreciate this film and really love it to its fullest. Like I really honestly fell in love with the movie right then and there when the end credits rolled after the final cut. So this is one of those rare instances where you can have a movie that has multiple different cuts, and each one of them actually enhances the viewing experience and actually makes the film better. This is a movie that is as well regarded as it is because of the other versions that have come out that people have been able to see. Once I saw the theatrical cut, I totally understood why critics back in 1982 were not that impressed with the film. I could see why the movie got mixed reviews. I could see why critics were like, nah, not really for me. There were some things about it that were really good, but there's other things about it that I didn't really care for. And I could see why the film wasn't that well received critically and didn't do that well financially. Because the theatrical cut, to be perfectly honest, is not a very good movie. It's average at best, and it relies way too much on Harrison Ford's narration, and he sounds like he would rather be anywhere else than in a recording studio doing narration for this film. And it shows. And it's painfully obvious every time you hear the narration. Also, the film has a weird ending, and you can tell that this is a film that was messed around with by the producers. The studio wanted a certain type of movie. Ridley Scott's vision was different, so the two butted heads, and the studio ended up re-editing it or throwing in certain things to make it the type of movie that they wanted to see, or they wanted, instead of the movie that they instead of the movie that the director that they hired wanted to make. So, thankfully, though, years later, the director's cut was released in theaters for a little bit. The film started to pick up a cult following on home video even before that, but definitely really picked up a huge following upon the release of the director's cut. That's when the movie really started to rise up the ranks. That's when the film started to get reviews from the same critics who said it was a bad movie or said they didn't quite care for it when it came out in 1982, and outright praising it. So this is a film that's absolutely 100% benefited from different cuts that were released to the public. I do not think that this film would be nearly as loved or as well regarded or as highly praised as it is now if the director's cut was never released or we never got the final cut. If it was just a theatrical cut that people had to go off of, this would go down in history as an interesting, intriguing at times, and visually breathtaking film, but a movie that as a whole just falters and doesn't quite get off the ground, and it would be one of those interesting failures. But that's not what happened. And I'm glad that's the case, because thankfully through the release of stuff like the director's cut and the final cut, audiences were able to see the version of the film that Ridley Scott wanted people to see. The final cut is the Blade Runner that Ridley wanted everybody to see in theaters in 1982, but for some reason he was not able to provide that cut to audiences. Now, Blade Runner also is a film that if you look at it and you see it and you view the movie as a sci-fi noir movie, if you look at it as more of a homage with science fiction elements to film noir, then you really can come to a really wonderful appreciation of the movie that you're not going to have if you don't have that context. Now, I know some people can enjoy the film without that context, but knowing the history of film noir or knowing of certain film noir classics and then watching Blade Runner, you can see so much inspiration that this film takes with film noir, and that's to the film's benefit. That's what helps to make the movie stand out, is the noir elements of it. In a lot of ways, you could say it created its own genre of sci-fi noir, that to this day there are a lot of films that are trying to emulate that. They're trying to be the next Blade Runner. And you can definitely see why. There's a very unique look and feel and atmosphere to Blade Runner that you don't really see in a lot of other sci-fi movies. Now, another thing about Blade Runner that really stands out, that's really something that you see a lot of inspiration in and from in a lot of films nowadays, is the production and art design. Sid Mead worked on a lot of different films, including Blade Runner, working as a visual futurist. And he worked on creating the future of Blade Runner of Los Angeles 2019. And he did a absolutely admirable and amazing job with creating what the look of the future in this film looks like. And so did the production designer who helped bring it to life. And the production designer who worked on this film, I want to make sure I mention his name, Lawrence G. Paul, as well as the art director David L. Snyder. They created a world that is iconic. That's every bit as iconic as the film itself as a whole. This is a world, like especially Chinatown, that multitude, like just a whole slew of films after Blade Runner wanted to emulate. They wanted to have that look. you can definitely see Christopher Nolan had inspiration from Blade Runner in the way that he shot certain scenes, Batman Begins, and the way certain things look. Even films like Super Mario Brothers have heavy inspiration from Blade Runner. The look of Dino Hatton is intentionally made to look like Chinatown from this film. And that's because the producers asked the production designers, who were mostly the same people who worked on Blade Runner, to make Daniel Hatton look like Chinatown from Blade Runner. So for a movie that, even at that time in 1993, was a film that was not really that well known in terms of box office or critical acclaim, it was still a movie that people remembered, and a lot of people in the industry had a lot of really good thoughts on. That was a film they looked at even in 1982 and were like, that's impressive. I want that. I want my film to look like Blade Runner. Even though the movie didn't do that well financially or critically, they still appreciated the film and the aspects that were in it, especially from the production standpoint. Now, enough of my sort of just beginning sort of intro to this review. I just wanted to kind of give just want to talk about a little bit about the legacy of Blade Runner and how it pertains to me personally. Now, Blade Runner, as you all know, is directed by Ridley Scott, and this is his follow-up to Alien. I would say Alien is my favorite film that he's done, but Blade Runner is a close second. And his direction is just masterful. It is marvelous. Like the way he sets up his shots is awe-inspiring. This is a guy who has just an amazing attention to detail and really knows how to bring a complex and complicated project like Blade Runner to life in such a mesmerizing way. And when you look at a film like Blade Runner, and then you look at what Ridley Scott is doing nowadays, you can't help but feel nostalgic in some ways for that Ridley Scott. For the Ridley Scott who did Blade Runner. Not the Ridley Scott nowadays who is well past his prime and has lost that golden touch that he absolutely had when he did Blade Runner. The film also features a solid script by Hampton Fancher and David Peoples that does a good job with its characters and with the world that the film shows to its audience in such breathtaking detail. And it's loosely based on a book or a story by Philip K. Dick called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? It features a absolutely stellar and spectacular score by Vangelis that is also one of the most influential scores I can think of. And the reason I'm saying that is because it inspired a whole new genre of music called synthwave. When you look at synthwave music, which is one of my favorite genres of music, by the way, and you look at a lot of synthwave artists, you can totally hear Vangelis's influence on their work. And you can even hear it from themselves. They've even said things like Blade Runner, like that score, man, that was the score that really lit the fire inside of me. That's the score that really got the juices flowing. That's the score that really made me want to make my own music. And that's a wonderful legacy. The film itself has a wonderful legacy, but so does the score by Vangelis, which is easily one of my favorite scores for any film, especially the end titles music, which I absolutely adore. I love that. Even when I wasn't even the biggest fan of the film when I first saw it when I was younger, I still came across really loving that score. It's a very atmospheric and moody score that just adds so much to the film. There are certain tracks from this movie that you could just listen to by themselves, and you're just automatically going to be drawn into and immersed in the world of Blade Runner because of how well put together and how well written the notes are and how well composed this entire score is by Vangelis. Excuse me. I'm just getting a little bit choked up, I guess, talking about Vangelis' score. Now before I go a little bit more into certain aspects of the film I want to talk about and I want to sing some praises on, I want to briefly mention this before, and this record that's slipping out here. Now, before Blade Runner had a official score by Vangelis that was actually released on CD, this was the only release of the score by Vangelis, which is an adaptation of certain tracks from Blade Runner by the New American Orchestra. For some reason, when the film was released, there was no soundtrack album with the score as it was heard and supposed to be heard on an album. There was just this orchestral version. It was one of those things that's still kind of a mystery. I've heard some rumors that maybe it had to do with Vangelis, and there's something to do with some of the studio that he was working for, the record label, and there were some disagreements between them and Warner Brothers. But whatever it is, for many years, all fans of Blade Runner had were bootlegs of the score with audio from the movie, and this orchestral score by the New American Orchestra. Which it's an interesting novelty piece to listen to. Some of the pieces are okay, but you can tell that this score was not meant to be orchestral. It was not meant to be a score that was anything but a digital synthesized score. The score doesn't have any... That does not... I mean, I'm just thinking... Because I just listened to this score recently. And... also then listened to the original score by Vangelis as it was heard in the film. And I was just so stunned by how, I don't know if inappropriate is the right way, but how much this orchestral score did not fit the film. Like, if this orchestral score was used in the movie, it would stick out like a sore thumb. You'd be watching Blade Runner and you'd be like, what is up with this music? It doesn't really fit the film that well. I like some of the notes, but I don't think the orchestral aspect fits the movie. And it doesn't. There's a reason why Vangelis did the score, for the most part, with synthesizers. Entirely synthesized. Because an orchestral score just does not fit the mood or the atmosphere of Blade Runner. And this is painfully evident when you listen to the new American orchestral version of the main titles. It sounds like a disco version. It's embarrassing. It's really bad. So it's an interesting novelty piece for Blade Runner fans, but it's one of those things that, yeah, I'm really glad that Blade Runner fans actually got to be able to own the score the way it was originally intended to be heard, finally, years later. With the original, it was like a 1993 or 1994 release with like 12 tracks from the score, and a special edition 3-disc set that was released around the time of the final cut when it came out on DVD and Blu-ray. I would love to own the 3-disc set for myself personally, because I really enjoy the score so much. Also, even though you have those other bits of the score, like even though you have this 3-disc set, that's still not all of the Blade Runner score. That's still not all of the music that Vangelis composed for the film that was used in the movie. So Blade Runner fans are still clamoring for more, even after a 3-disc set. And it's totally understandable why. It is an absolutely spectacular score. I can't say that enough. Now, I also want to mention the cinematography by Jordan Cronenweth, which is visually a tour de force. Like, his cinematography in this film is second to none, and the way that he collaborated with Ridley Scott is a sight to behold. These are two men who are at the top of their craft, working together in their prime, and it really is something that is magical. It really is. It's a magical uh, film to watch when it comes to the cinematography and the direction, and how those two things blend together seamlessly. It also features some solid editing, some excellent editing by Terry Rawlings and Marsha Nakashima, and for a film that's 117 minutes, I thought it had pretty good pacing, at least the final cut. Um, I like the fact that this is a film that has some deep themes of humanism and what it means to be human and some other things like that, and technology and the fear of technology and so on and so forth. And it has subtext, but it's not in your face, and it doesn't dominate the film or the story. The story is still given plenty of time to breathe, as are the characters. And I like how the main crux of the story is very simple. It's not a plot within another plot. It's just, you have this character named Deckard, who's a Blade Runner, who is tasked with the job of trying to hunt down and kill these other replicants who have escaped. And these replicants are willing to do whatever it takes to prolong their lifespan, to make it so they can live longer. And that's the main crux of the story. It's quite simple, actually, and that's to the film's benefit. It's a movie that's widely regarded as one of the best science fiction movies ever made for a reason, but it also has a pretty straightforward story. And that's another thing that really draws me to this film, especially the final cut, or just the director's cut, or maybe the international cut. I personally felt it was easy to follow. I think it could have easily been something that could have been a jumbled mess, or something that could be hard to follow, but that's not the case. And that's in large part to the script by Hampton Fancher and David Peoples. Now, before I talk about the cast, which I kind of want to save for last, because they're the, in a lot of ways, they are the things that really make this film just reach its fullest potential. Because if you don't have a cast who's capable, and you don't have the right people casted for the roles, then you can have a phenomenal script, you can have a great director, you can have all these different elements, but none of that's going to matter if you don't have the right cast to bring it all to life. But I also want to quickly mention, of course, the production and the art design and the visual effects. Blade Runner has some of the most impressive model work that I've seen in a film. The designs that Sid Mead came up with, and the designs that were brought to life, that were shown on screen with a combination of models and matte paintings and other visual effects, it's tantalizing. It's tantalizing, and it's absolutely tremendous. It's very special. And I mean that. The special effects in Blade Runner are special. And there's a reason why a lot of people look back at Blade Runner nowadays and look at it. It's one of the most impressive films in terms of visual and practical effects, and for good reason. From the look of the spinners, or from the spinners themselves, or the city, the cityscape. It's just one of those movies that has so much going for it in terms of its visual effects. And it didn't have like the biggest budget in the world either. At a decent sized budget for the time. $28 million in 1982 was definitely not chump change, but it's not like this is a movie that cost like $50 million or whatever. But I mean, just at inflation, it probably would be around the amount of money that was spent on the film. But it definitely does show. This is not a cheap looking movie. And you could definitely see the influence. Once again, this film has influenced so many movies in so many different ways. From the music, or not just movies, I mean just music in general, or just stories, or people. It's just, you could argue that Blade Runner is one of the most influential films of all time. Easily. And there's a lot of arguments in this film's favor when it comes to that claim. from a visual perspective, from a visual effects perspective, you got films like Judge Dredd, the 1995 film, which the design of Mega City 1 is clearly inspired by Blade Runner. You could argue that it's ripped off. You could argue that they ripped off Blade Runner for the design of Mega City 1. I think it's different enough that it's its own thing, but you could definitely see the parallels between the two. Or look at something like The Fifth Element. There's a lot of Blade Runner aspects in the production and art design for that movie. So, yeah, I had to mention that. I cannot not mention that aspect of the film because it's easily one of the most iconic things about the movie. I mean, just the design. I mean, just the look of the buildings and everything is really a sight for sore eyes. It's one of those things that elevates the film to a level that very few films ever reach. And then you have the cast that rounds it all up and ties everything together. You got Harrison Ford as Rick Deckard. This is one of his best performances, in my opinion, of his career. It's a more subdued performance, a more subdued role for Harrison, but he pulls it off brilliantly. This was a different type of role for him at this point in his career, and because of how well he performed here and how well he just knocked this character out of the park, it opened up a lot of doors for Harrison in terms of his career and in terms of roles for Harrison down the line. I personally feel that this is the stepping stone for his performances for films like the Jack Ryan movies, like Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger, or films like Witness and so on. I definitely don't feel that if he didn't do this, that and if he didn't do as well of a job as he did in Blade Runner as Deckard, that he really would have been able to, or he would have gotten the same roles as he got post Blade Runner, despite its lack of critical and financial success at the time in 1982. Rutger Hauer also delivers one of the best performances of his career as Roy Batty in a very early role, and you could totally see a star in the making here. Rutger himself even views this as his favorite film and one of his favorite roles, and you could definitely see why. Rutger was perfectly cast in this role. He has a physical presence, but he's also such a great actor that he's able to take this character who is inhuman and make it come to life in a way that you really buy that he's a replicant. Like, you buy that this is who he is. Like, this isn't one of those things where you're like, yeah, I don't really necessarily buy this. You totally buy it. And that's because of Rutger Hauer and his performance. You buy that on the outside he looks like he's human, but on the inside he's something else entirely. Sean Young also does an equally as impressive job as Rachel. Another role that is arguably the best role of an actor's career. Sean Young's performance as Rachel is, I would probably argue, is the best performance of her career. She also does an admirable job playing this character who looks on the outside, appears to be human, but at the inside, she's not. I think she did a great job playing this character and really showing the distance between humanity. This is a character that looks human and can act human at times, but there's certain moments where you can tell that there's this dissonance, that she's definitely not playing something that is entirely human. It wants to be human, but you can tell that there's something that's just not right. Edward James Olmos was solid in a bit role as Gaff, as was Emmett Walsh as Harry Bryant. Daryl Hannah had a very memorable role as Pris Stratton. She's just a bundle of energy, and you could tell, even in this film and this bit role that she had, that she was going to go on to bigger and brighter things. William Sanderson as J.F. Sebastian is also quite good. Brion James, it's always nice to see him. He was really well cast as this hulking replicant, and did a good job of what he was asked to do. Joe Turkel was also fine as Dr. Eldon Tyrell, and by fine I don't mean like fine in terms of like, hey, it was okay. No, I mean fine in terms of like really finely crafted cutlery. You know, cutlery, fine. If I could say that fucking word. But, you know, fine crafted material is fine. He really took this role and ran with it. He sunk his teeth. Sorry, I mean, just think about Blade Runner kind of just scrambling my brain cells a little bit. Joe Turkel really sunk his teeth into this role and was perfectly cast as Tyrell. And even little bit roles like Joanna Cassidy as Zora and James Hong as Hannibal, they also lend a lot to this film. Or not necessarily lend a lot to the movie, but add a lot to the movie. So, I really don't know what else to say about Blade Runner that hasn't already been said by a multitude of other critics. And I'm starting to run out of energy. And I pretty much said everything I really wanted to say about the film. I love the movie. Like I said, it's a movie that really grew on me. I would say it's definitely one of my favorite sci-fi films. And it's about as flawless of a sci-fi movie as there is. There's only a few nitpicks I have, and they mainly deal with some things like, for instance, there's a scene where Deckard pretty much forces himself on Rachel, and I thought that was pretty awkward, and I understand why it's there, but I still don't feel it adds that much to the story or to the characters, and I think it could have easily been cut out of the movie. But that's only the one little nitpick I have for the film. Other than that, I got nothing. I got nothing bad to say about the movie. I got nothing but good and happy thoughts about it, and I really do highly recommend this film. I can't recommend it enough. For those of you who have been on the fence about the film, or for those of you who weren't that big of a fan of it, I do recommend you give it another watch. Especially the final cut. Because I was in the same boat as you. And I gave it more chances, and it was definitely worth it. So anyway, thanks for watching, and as always, I will see you guys later. See ya.